Okay, Chris?
Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Seafair and USDA Economist Group webinar of 2018. My name is Chris Burns. I am an economist at the USDA Economic Research Service. And I just want to mention a few things before we get started. The USDA Economist Group is a group that is its mission is to be a responsible and independent advocate for economists at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as the Washington community, the agricultural economics profession, and society at large. Anybody can join. You don't have to be an economist. And we are not officially affiliated with the USDA. To give you a little more background, the Economic Research Service, for those of you who may not know, is an agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture that provides unbiased research to policymakers with economic analysis that helps them with decision making. Today's presentation will be done by ERS economist Nicholas Rada, alongside with his co-author Bill Liefert. They are economists in the Markets and Trade Division of the Economic Research Service and the International Trade and Development Branch. Nick will be presenting his report with Bill that's entitled Productivity Growth and the Revival of Russian Agriculture. So I'm now going to turn it over to Nick, and he's going to start us off.
Thank you very much, Chris. 1 second. Okay, my name is Nicholas Rada. This research is part of a broader research portfolio that I've been investigating to look at the agricultural performance of some of the rapidly emerging agricultural economies, Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, to try and figure out what their performance is based on and the policies that are improving or decelerating productivity growth in those countries. Today, for the joint webinar for Seafair and the USDA Economist Group, I and Bill Liefert will be presenting our report of Productivity Growth and the Revival of Russian Agriculture. All right. As Russia moved from a planned economy to a market economy in the early 1990s, we can see in this figure that they initiated a substantial contraction of agricultural output, specifically grain production. By the late 1990s, grain production had recovered. And we can see that in 1990, this was the peak of the Soviet agricultural production. As they shifted to a market economy, as I said, and we saw a collapse of agricultural production and grains in this instance until 1998 in their economic crisis, in which they transitioned more properly to the market incentives of the market economy and started to see grain production increases. We also see from the 1990s to about the mid-2000s a substantial drop in meat production. This is especially important to the Soviet Union and the Russian economy because supplying meat to its population for consumption was a priority to the Soviet government as a way of showing economic development despite low GDP per capita as compared to other developed countries. The reduction of meat output was a painful reallocation of resources away from an overexpanded and uncompetitive high-cost subsector, and the contraction of meat production has been eyed by the Russian government as a situation that needs to be reversed. The transition from the 1990s to the 2000s was a period in which Russia was the largest foreign market for U.S. poultry. An increase in meat production in the post-2000 period, especially in the post-2009 period, has led to a drop in meat imports, such that presently Russia serves to be only about 10% of U.S. poultry exports. So what is our research purpose? Our research purpose is to ask whether Russia's agricultural revival has been due to adding more resources to the production process or due to improvements in total factor productivity. That is to say, has this rebound in grain production spurred exports, this rebound in meat production, which has led to a decline in the amount of meat imports, is that based on supplying and adding new resources or more resources to produce output, or is this through an improvement in the productive efficiency of operations? We want to know if the growth rebound in Russian agriculture is in fact due to advancements in total factor productivity. Where is that growth occurring and in which commodities? So first, let's speak to what is total factor productivity. Now, when we speak of output growth, typically people speak of value growth. So when we evaluate agricultural productivity, this is a quantity-based ratio. It's output per unit of input. We want to eliminate price effects because the value of agricultural production can shift when, in fact, the volume produced may not be changing. So we don't want to capture that. We want to focus just on real output growth. Now, real output growth can be decomposed into area expansion or adding more land to production, or by increasing yields, that is, increasing the amount produced per hectare. Now, that yield growth itself can be decomposed into input intensification or adding more inputs per hectare, or to TFP growth. Now, this is science-led growth where the application of new technologies and better farm management practices lead to what we'd like to say is a more sustainable long-term approach to productivity growth. If the focus is on an input-led growth, where you're using more inputs per hectare and expanding your agricultural footprint, then that comes at a cost of resource constraints. There's only so much land, labor, fertilizer, irrigation, capital that can be applied in a given year, and if they want to focus on the long-term sustainability of the production, if Russian agriculture wants to be able to ensure it increases its grain exports, continues to decrease its meat imports, then we want to know how efficient has this production rebound been, and whether it's been based on new technologies and better farm management practices, or whether it's just continuing the Soviet approach to production of throwing more resources at it. So that being said, let's get a handle of Russia. We have 7 districts that are color-coded and 78 regions within those districts. The analysis that we focus on is a district-level analysis, so we'll be focusing on, say, the Far East in pink on the right, or the Siberia in the middle in yellow, or the Ural in green. Now, on the western edge of the Ural region are the Ural Mountains, which has a big geographical differentiation in Russian agriculture. On the western half of the Ural, in the north, we have the Northwest, and the central coming down to the Volga in purple, and the south in brown. So that just gives you a general overview of Russia and its districts and regions. Now, on the top right-hand corner, we're going to look at gross agricultural output from 1961 to 2014. And there we can see that agricultural output rose over that 30-year period to peak in 1990, at which point the Soviet Union transitioned to a market economy. The contraction of agricultural output occurred until about 1998, when they had an economic crisis, and after which there's been substantial recovery. Now, the data reliability is quite poor between 1990 and 1994, so therefore our own analysis initiates in 1994. So I put a little line there, and what this figure is showing us is from 1994 to 2013, what have been the changes in production volumes in Russian agriculture. We see there have been expanding production of sugar, sunflower seeds, meat, and grains, and a contraction in milk, flax, and potatoes. Now, grain production and meat production are 2 primary commodities of importance to Russian agriculture and as well to global trade. And what is the composition of that output? Well, we see that since the 1990s, there's been a long-term transition towards more wheat and more corn at the expense of rye and other grains. Excuse me. And we also see that the rebounding in the meat production is not based off of cattle meat as it was in the early 1990s, but to a long-term trend starting at around the 1998 economic crisis towards more poultry production. And this goes along with this consistent idea of trying to develop their own feed supplies. They're growing their own maize, their own sunflower seed, and crushing it for oil to improve the feed that they're providing to new technologies, say better chicks, better broilers, and then using an organizational structure that came in after the economic crisis in 1998. There were a lot of very large agro holdings or very large vertically integrated producers who were able to institute agribusiness principles to optimize the productive efficiency of the operation. And this had substantial effects to promoting, in particular, poultry production. Now, we have a little bit of a sense now then of the output that was produced in the rebound agricultural production, and we want to learn a little bit how the factors of production in Russia have changed. As we can see in the figure, we have falling laborers or a falling labor force across all districts and over time in Russia. And this is consistent with nearly all inputs. We see land reached its nadir in about 2006, after which there is has been a marginal increase in the land used in production. And we see, similar to machinery capital, livestock capital decelerated quite quickly, and around the mid-2000s leveled off and started to grow somewhat on average across Russian regions over the 1994-2013 period. Now, of all the inputs and the production factors that are used, fertilizer stands alone as the one to rebound most quickly and grow in a positive direction. Now we can see the gray line that starts on the left-hand axis just under the 200 measure is the South District, and it is in third position in terms of fertilizer use in 1994 and finished in 2013 as the top fertilizer user. In fact, the South and the Central District have been the primary determinants of the rising national fertilizer use after 2004. The Volga District, which has transitioned away from grains and meat somewhat, was the primary user of fertilizer and has shifted away from that input over time. So what have been the implications of these changes in inputs, changes in outputs? We see across districts declining revenue shares apart from the South. And the South stands apart for its substantial rise and consistent increase over time in its revenue shares. It is unique across Russia, apart from the Central District, which in the final time period did see a rebound. And we'll see some of the parallels to that insight coming in the next slides. Now here's a map of Russia where we have imposed the production trends on top. Now the purpose here is not to look at volume numbers or years, but to simply look at the trends between 1994 and 2013. If we want to start on the right-hand side of the figure, we can see that the Far East had declining production trends. This is true also in the Northwest, the Purple District. The Ural and Siberia had some fluctuations, as did the Volga, but appear to be fairly level or consistent in terms of there doesn't appear to be any long-term growth, positive or negative, which is not true for the Central and South districts, which observed substantial production increases, particularly to grains, but also to sugar beets and vegetables. Now the South appears to be the strongest performer, grains being its most prominent crop. And what we see here is that of the grains, maize and wheat really took off in that region compared to other regions. I mean, the South quickly transitioned under the new market structure of the economy and was rapidly able to expand production of these grain commodities. So where does that leave us? We want to look at Russia's agricultural TFP growth. What was their productivity over the 1994-2013 period? Now we can see that there are effectively three time periods in this figure. The first time period is from 1994 to the 1998 economic crisis. This is a period in which inputs contracted more quickly than outputs, leading to positive TFP growth, but this should not be interpreted really as TFP growth in terms of expansion of production possibilities while holding inputs fixed or as a performance indicator. This rather is a period in which there's substantial restructuring going on, and it is unclear really what's going on. Everything seems to be kind of shedding resources and reducing output. Now, once we get to 1998, up until 2005, 2006, when inputs finally hit their nadir, output growth finally reaches 1994 levels. We see that output growth has again risen, inputs continue to decline, and TFP growth strengthened above the previous period. Now, this is a period of time that is of particular importance, and we will shed substantial light on that in just one second. The third period is between 2005 to 2013. This is when, on average, across Russian regions, agricultural inputs are now being applied to the production process to produce outputs. Output growth is rising, and TFP growth is rising. And if we were to look at Russian agriculture over this long period of time of shedding resources and restructuring, and we wanted to say, what is our most confident measure of the improvement in the performance of agriculture, we would look at this period and say, hey, look, if we wanted to be looking forward, we would say Russia's agricultural TFP growth was about 1.7%. This is about on par with the global average. It's slightly below what we would expect from a large agricultural economy, but it is not surprising given the limited access of farmers to agricultural innovations and irrigation. This is predominantly a rain-fed agricultural sector. So in that middle period, when output growth rebounded and input growth continued to decline, why was it that output growth was able to rebound? Well, that was because of the South District, as we see here. These are output growth trends from 1994 to 2013 at the district level. And we can see production in the South dropped more quickly than in the rest of the economy as they more quickly recovered from the restructuring that was going on. And in 1998, they rebounded more quickly to grow their agricultural output at a far more rapid pace than the rest of the economy. Now, if we wanted to look at input growth, all right, this is going to give us insight into when producers stopped shedding unproductive resources and started applying their factors of production to produce output in what we would call a productive way. And so we can see that the South rebounded the most quickly in 1999, and from then on was increasing the factors of production because those factors were of higher productivity than in previous periods. Output growth responded in kind. Now we can see the timing of that turnaround in input growth varied substantially over Russian districts. The national average was around 2005, 2006. However, by 2013, the Volga district had yet to, on average across regions, slow the shedding of those inputs. So the Russian South, which appears to be the agricultural engine of Russia's agricultural recovery, again, as we noted earlier, rebounded agricultural output around 1998, agricultural inputs by around 1999, such that over that period, agricultural productivity growth was rising at about 3.6%. Now, this is a fairly rapid rate of productivity growth that would be equivalent to some of the estimates we've seen in Brazil or in some areas of China. These are quite robust. It's a quite robust estimate of agricultural productivity growth. Now, if we want to look at how this restructuring has affected agricultural producers across the country, we take a look at output growth from 1994 to 2013 at the regional or oblast level, and we've highlighted those states that account for about 99% of Russia's agricultural output. And we can see that all of those regions, which are accelerating output at greater than 3% are all in the South, though there is some growth in other regions. Of importance here, though, are the substantial number of oblasts that have negative output growth. Now, if we restrict that time period to just the 2005 to 2013 period, we see some of that high output growth has migrated to the Central District, and there is far fewer states with negative output growth, but we see that that period of restructuring has not ended for all producers. So in conclusion, Russia's agricultural rebound does appear to be based on improvements in total factor productivity. However, they are highly regionalized, and our best estimates suggest that TFP in Russian agriculture has accelerated at about a 1.7%. That TFP growth has been driven almost entirely by producers in the South, who it is hypothesized have leveraged climatic, infrastructural, and institutional comparative advantages over other districts. We find modern agricultural practices and technologies, fertilizer application, agribusiness practices, hybrid corn, vertically integrated enterprises have contributed to TFP growth. Now, one of the policies that has not been most prominent are long-term investments in agricultural research. Russia does have an agricultural research system. It has been largely characterized as disassociated with providing the types of technologies that smallholders in Russia require. The Russian ag research system is not connected with the international research system. And so what we see are that most of the agricultural effort in terms of science and technology policy are focused on, say, wheat, and then specifically on biotic stresses like wheat rust. So it's focusing more on yield mitigation technologies and not necessarily yield enhancing technologies. So there is a question that comes about saying, after all the managerial reforms and implementation of modern agribusiness practices, how far can Russia's agricultural improvements to productivity go without the applications of innovative science policy? And that's a question we are looking at in our work in progress. While much of the progress has been in the South in terms of productivity performance, the Central District was a late but surprising performer in the final 6-7 years, reaching TFP of about 3% as it paralleled the South. And what it appears to be is the migration of these agribusiness practices and technologies to other regions. Now, we have some work in progress where we're taking some econometric models and the data that we used for this report to try and decompose TFP growth to look at technical change versus efficiency change. And that is to say how productivity growth has moved for the best practice producers relative, and how that distribution of performances between the best practice and the average has changed. And we want to test the hypotheses in the literature that the southern and central producers have achieved their higher technical and efficiency progress due to those public infrastructural, human capital, and R&D investments. However, that seems to be more on work in progress. And before we get to questions, I wanted to hand off the microphone to my colleague Bill Leifer to speak a little bit more about the implications of our results to global trade.
Well, the results of our study are important for U.S. and world agricultural trade, and as such should interest policymakers, U.S. commercial agriculture, and researchers. Since about 2000, the three main grain-producing countries of the former Soviet Union, that is Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, have individually and especially collectively become big grain exporters. As such, they are now major grain export competitors of the United States, not so much of corn, but mainly of wheat. During the last few years, Russia alone has supplied about 10% of total world exports of grain and 15% of total world exports of wheat, and consequently has surpassed the United States as the biggest grain exporter. Our study is relevant to this development because productivity growth in Russian agriculture increases the country's output of wheat and other crops, which in turn increases the surplus of these crops available for export. Now, on the import side, Russia's main agricultural imports are the high-value products of livestock goods, fruits and vegetables, and processed foods. So the effect of output increasing productivity growth for imports, of course, you increase more output, that's going to have the isolated effect of decreasing those imports. And the one important product for which this has affected U.S. agriculture is poultry, as Nick mentioned before. From the mid-1990s to the peak export year of 2008, Russia was the largest foreign market for U.S. poultry. But then due to increases in Russian production, as well as border measures, protectionist border measures that Russia imposed against poultry exports, our poultry exports to Russia now are very low. And so consequently, Russia is actually a very small market for U.S. agricultural goods.
Great, thank you, Bill. For that, I would say that is the end of the presentation, and we'd be happy to take questions. And as you can see on the slide, we provide the access to the reports and the Amber Waves, which is a policy-oriented magazine-type publication that ERS puts out. So with that, thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you, Nick, for your presentation. That was very informative. This is Karen Gala. I'm the Executive Director of the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics, and we always enjoy partnering with the USDA Economist Group for these events. I wanted to remind folks that if they have any questions, they can enter them in the question box. All the colleagues and experts at ERS are also available to answer questions over email. So if you have a question that you'd rather not share publicly, feel free to contact them directly. So the first question is there a migration of that happens of innovation and technology into Russia, even though they aren't emphasizing an investment in that area per se as of late?
Okay, thank you for the question. It seems to me that most of the innovations that we're seeing in Russian agriculture at this point are managerial, which are things that are not necessarily need to be purchased. This is understanding business practices, reacting to market incentives, vertically integrating. These are not innovations that require long-term investments in agricultural science and technology. The science and technology investments that we do see appear not to be improving the technical progress or shifting out the production possibilities frontier, but rather lifting up the average relative to them. Again, focusing on yield mitigation technologies for wheat, their primary grain crop. There is some importation of animals, presumably in the poultry sector, so that when they're combining their improved maize feed with sunflower crushed oilseed, they can get the highest return to those investments. However, we're not seeing a lot of investment in seed technologies. There's been some chatter by the Russian Foreign Ministry of Agriculture talking about type of import substitution industrialization to agricultural seed technologies, but there's been a lot of wishing and washing, ebbing and flowing of opinion on that. I think there are some legitimate concerns about the ability of the Russian seed system to provide viable technologies to expand productivity in the future.
Great, thank you. Is there additional comment?
No, I have no more if there's other questions.
Okay, so we have two questions that relate to each other. The question is, I have noted that Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan have enjoyed 5 consecutive years of good grain yields and production. What is the proportion that can be attributed to favorable weather? And the other question is, does Russia in this area in general stand to benefit from changes in climate?
So the southern part of the country does have the best climate. We have, in our work in progress, we are investigating whether warmer temperatures in the growing month of July have contributed to higher productivity growth in the south relative to other regions. That's not the best indicator to use. We understand that, but it is one that is supplied by the Russian Ministry of Agriculture for every region. And we're finding no correlation between improved weather and technical change or productivity growth. And so while there certainly is a correlation between the weather in the southern part of Russia and the production possibilities, we're not finding at this point a statistical association between them. Do you have any other comments, Bill?
I'll just make a general comment that the increase in grain production and thereby export by those three countries, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, I mean, we feel it's been largely driven by productivity growth and improvements they've been making on the ground. But favorable weather probably has played some role. If you just look at the quality of weather year by year, they have had a good run recently. For example, from 1996 to 2000, that 5-year period, in only one of those years did Russia really have generally favorable weather compared to other years. Whereas since that time, since 2000, they have a generally favorable weather in almost the bulk of those years. I think they had poor weather in only about 3 to 4 years. So weather is playing some role. It's just that it's hard to quantify, even though, as Nick pointed out, we're going to try to get some sort of quantitative handle on it in our immediate future work.
Yeah,
Great,
thank you for
you.
the question.
So we'll take 2 more questions. If somebody wants to submit one, we already have one in the queue. So the question was, has there been a change from the old communist type co-ops? Is this the managerial change you've been referring to in part? From the old communist type co-ops to Western style producer co-ops? And perhaps you might also want to just explain what old communist type co-ops mean for those who don't know.
Sure. So, I'll hand it off to Bill to give you a couple comments, but I just wanted to emphasize, during the Soviet period, farms were expected to be non-specialized. They were expected to effectively be self-sufficient and locally self-sufficient in the supply of commodities. The transition to a market economy emphasized response to market indicators, the importance of profit, and the role of specialization both in the localized production of commodities as well as in the commodities produced. So we've seen transition of grain production to the south, transition of meat production, and some regions are now becoming specialized not so much by an increase in the production, but rather decreases in productions where they had no comparative advantage and probably in commodities they might not have been producing productively to begin with. And so from a just general point of view, very high level, I would say that's one way of thinking about the big difference in the mental aspect of transitioning from the plan to the market economy.
Well, here are just a few words about Russian farm structure. During the Soviet period, the producers were large state and collective farms. They had thousands of hectares. During the transition period, the movement when the economy and agriculture moved from the central plan to the more market-led economy, these large producers were not broken up. They had to officially reorganize themselves. Most of them became corporate farms owned by their workers and management. But initially, at least till 2000, there was very little change in how they actually conducted themselves. So production, and that has continued to the present time. I mean, there has been some improvement as to how they actually perform. But Russian agriculture continues to be dominated by these large former state collective farms, though one development has actually been in the opposite direction, that there have been the rise of these agri-holdings, which are large vertically integrated enterprises that combine a number of farms, and as we vertically integrated, They combine primary production with also processing, distribution, sometimes even retail sale, but that's a movement toward actually larger scale rather than smaller scale. Now, one development under the new market-oriented transition system in Russia, as well as in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, has been the development of what are called family farms. And these are farms kind of similar to U.S. family farms. They're not as large. In Russia, they're about 50 to 100 hectares on average, and they do specialize in bulk crop production, such as wheat and barley. But in Russia, as well as in Ukraine, they still do not account for the lion's share of production. They own less than 20% of the land and account for, in Russia, I would say, no more than 10% of all agricultural output.
Thanks. Is there another question?
We're going to close right now, but encourage the audience to reach out to these experts at ERS, and also let us know. My email is cgala@seafair.org. Let us know if you have other topics that you'd like us to cover. Thanks so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.